Hello, church history friends. Thank you for joining us today as we welcome Kees Olijnsma to the Spring Lecture Series. Today, we'll hear the fascinating story of Community of Christ in the Netherlands. Joining me today are Peter Smith and Joey Williams. Peter is signing in from Central Michigan and helping out behind the scenes, while Joey Williams is coming to us from Independence, Missouri. Joey is today's host, so I'll turn the microphone over to him for the rest of the program. Thank you both.
Well, thank you, Barb. I'm really excited about today's lecture with Kees Olijnsma. Our program schedule is in the chat, and we look forward to questions from the audience. So remember that you can post in the Q&A feature. This is a function that's at the bottom of your screen. And also remember that the Q&A function is separate and different from the chat function. So be sure any of your questions go in the Q&A, and we'll go over those questions once our speaker has concluded his remarks today. So let me introduce you to our speaker. Kees Olijnsma is a convert to Community of Christ, and he was baptized at the age of 17, and that's quite a story if he could share that with you someday. His professional career as marketing, sales, and business development manager was with Friesland Campina, the world's largest dairy cooperative. And if you've never had fla, you've got to try that someday. I won't say it's yogurt, but it might be a little bit like yogurt. In those roles, he visited over 50 different countries on all continents except Oceania. In Community of Christ, Kees has served as pastor of the largest congregation in Europe. He's been a national leader and a national ministry coordinator, and he's also served in the role of high priest. And Kees seems to always be up to something, so he's always busy, but his work shoes that he's most comfortable in, I think, are his klompen, which are those amazing wooden shoes that Holland is famous for. And he's usually out working in his garden or working around the church building in those shoes. Kees retired in 2018, but he stayed busy, especially with his involvement in the church's mission. And I'm going to take a moment to show you what he's been up to lately. He was just a part of the Dutch hymnal team that just last month was able to have a hymnal launch of the new collection of 269 songs in Gemeenschap van Christus Zingt. And this has many of the songs that we find translated from Community of Christ Sings. And a few of those, Kees actually was the translator for those songs himself. And as part of that launch, he also spent time translating this 98, I think, page, Sharing in Community of Christ, which was also distributed to all of those who participated in the hymnal launch, and is a wonderful missional companion as a resource to help all of those who come from outside of Community of Christ to understand more about who we are and what we're about. Dus, Kees, ik ben blij dat je hier bent. Welkom. And thank you for joining us this evening from the Netherlands, where it's evening right now. So I'll turn the spotlight over to you as we're ready to hear your story behind the development of the Community of Christ in the Netherlands up to 1948. Take it away.
Thank you, Joey, for the introduction. I want to talk about the development of the Community of Christ in the Netherlands from 1841 to 1948. That seems a very long period, but basically the story begins in 1920. Everything what happened before is to be mentioned, but is not really a great story. I wanted to introduce myself first, but Joey has already done all of that, so I can skip that one. But let me introduce a little bit about the Netherlands, because many people do not even know where it is, because it's rather small. It's a small country, and you see it here a little bit to the right from the United Kingdom, what many people know where it is, with London. And the Netherlands, as the word is saying, it means low land. And some 55% of the Netherlands is below sea level. So we live in a kind of a dangerous world, because if the dikes will break, everything will be underwater, at least for 55% or even more. And the lowest point we have is a point which is 7 meters or 22 feet below sea level. So if you ever fly to the Netherlands and you land at Amsterdam Schiphol, just realize the moment you have landed, you're 4 meters or 13 feet below sea level. Netherlands has around 17.5 million inhabitants, so we are ranking number 69 on the world scale, but we are quite a dense country because we have a lot of people on a square mile. And in that respect, we are on the number 29 in the world ranking. So it's a small country with a lot of people, where Amsterdam is the capital. Many people know Amsterdam. But the Netherlands is also the delta of 3 rivers. There is the River Rhine coming all the way from Switzerland. There is the Maas coming from France, and there's the Schelde, who is coming from Belgium. And as you know, where the delta is of rivers, the soil is fertile. So there's a lot of things happening, but there's also a lot of trade happening. And in that sense, until recent, some Chinese harbors have taken that role, but Rotterdam was the biggest port of the world. There's a lot of trade, sea ships coming in, and then it's been transported to, let's say, the countries on the other side, which is Germany, Austria, France, Belgium. So there's a lot of traffic going on. Netherlands is known for its tulips, its wooden shoes or clocks, so to speak, and about our windmills. And a few Dutch persons, many of you know them. It's either Rembrandt, Van Gogh, the 2 main painters. There is Anne Frank about her diary in the Second World War. And for all your sport fans, especially soccer fans, there is, of course, Johan Cruyff, which needs to be mentioned. Let's go back to our story. The first attempt to bring the Restoration to the Netherlands was in 1841. And in 1840, in the Nauvoo Conference, Orson Hyde, counsel to Joseph Smith, and later became the president of the Council of 12 of the LDS Church, had a vision. And he wrote that vision down in the conference and presented it. And a quote out of that vision is, "The cities of London, Amsterdam, Constantinople, which we nowadays call Istanbul, and Jerusalem, all appeared in succession before me. And the Spirit said, many children of Abraham there be gathered. The Lord says, here also is field of your labors. Go ye forth to the cities which have been shown to you. Let your warning voice be heard among the Gentiles as you pass." And during that conference in 1840 in Nauvoo, Orson Hyde was given the assignment to do mission among the Jews in Europe. And Hyde arrived in Rotterdam, of course, by boat, because we're talking here 1840. It was just the beginning of the steamboat. The sailboats were a little bit gone. So it was a little bit quicker than before, because in other days it took 1.5 months. Now he could do it in a little over 2 weeks, but still it took some time in sometimes rough sea. But Hyde came to the Netherlands, and his reports do not mention any encounters or any strides to proclaim the gospel to the people. Basically, his writings can be read more like a tourist brochure. Let me quote what he wrote on Rotterdam. "The cleanliness of its streets, the antique order of its architecture, the numerous shade trees, the great number of canals filled with ships with different parts of the world. This place is a peculiarity resembled nowhere else in the world." It doesn't really sound like he is on a mission. It more sounds he's the tourist in the Netherlands enjoying his time over there. From his reports, we can only read that he had a meeting with an Hebrew rabbi. But the conversation was difficult, as it had been written down, because the rabbi did not speak English, and he did not speak Dutch, of course. So it was a very difficult conversation. Still, Hyde wrote an address to the Hebrews, and that was translated into Dutch and printed. And that basically was the first tract ever been written in Dutch. However, we could not find any record which tract that has been. Yet, at the end of his few months of stay in the Netherlands, Hyde had no converts. He was not successful. He was also not successful in Germany, where basically the same has happened. A few pamphlets were translated into German, and that was it. However, in Jerusalem, he was more successful. And even in Jerusalem, there is the Orson Hyde Memorial Garden, which is being established by the LDS Church and also being kept and maintained over there. So it seems that his attempt to find, let's say, converts in all the 4 cities he has mentioned, only he was somewhat successful in Jerusalem. That was 1841. And now we move to 1861. That is 20 years later. And in these 20 years, of course, we know in the history of the Restoration, a lot has happened. 1844, we have an assassination of Joseph and Hiram Smith. We had Brigham Young, who leads a LDS group to Salt Lake City. And from there on, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sent 2 missionaries to the Netherlands. 1861, 20 years later. One of them was a native. It was a Dutchman, Anne Wiggers van der Woude. And his birthplace is in the province of Friesland, which is in the north of the Netherlands. And his visit, his missionary work led to the first baptisms of the LDS Church in the Netherlands on October 1, 1861. And Anne Wiggers, he baptized his brother, his sister-in-law, and his sister. It was not that successful because we know from records that none of them stayed in the LDS Church. However, there is a big statue. I will show you the statue. And the statue says that on October 1, 1861, these people were baptized. The date you see on the bottom of the statue is the date of when the memorial was put over there. And it's still being kept and maintained well by the LDS Church. And it also had a big memorial in 2011 celebrating that the LDS Church was 150 years in the Netherlands. But you might wonder, we're talking about the Community of Christ history in the Netherlands. So why are we then moving to this sidestep? Well, it's interesting to notice that, and then we have a small Google map, is that on the left side with the red point, that's the place the baptisms were. But if you go down on the right place, you will see right on the right under, you see Zwaag Westeinde. That is the place where the largest Community of Christ congregation in Europe has been grounded and founded. So basically, 2 different groups from the Restoration set by Joseph Smith, they end up in the Netherlands just 5 miles from each other. So, and it is not in the capital city or in a big port, but it's in the Frisian, in the Dutch countryside. So that was a very interesting thing to notice. And the other thing, which is also interesting to notice, is that the use of native Dutch persons for mission is crucial in order to find people, to find converts. The Community of Christ did not really learn that lesson by 1869, because they had a second attempt in 1869, and they sent Elke Jasper, it sounds Dutch, but he wasn't, appointed as the first missionary to the Netherlands. But the same as Orson Hyde, he just came for a very short period in 1869. He came only for a few months and left on November 18 the same year, disappointed and disillusioned. And he quotes in his reports, "I did not have any money and I could not find any man to assist me. I had to pay for every meal." So there was an economic reason. People could not assist him. People did not have the money to help him. But he didn't find also any basis where he could start from, because he was not a native. He did not speak the language, he did not know the culture, and he had no family or relatives where he could, let's say, start. The second reason for no success was that there were a lot of missionary efforts by the Mormons. He called them Brigham Knights in his reports. I'm still just as I know that the Mormon Church does not want to be called Mormon Church anymore. So, but for clarity's sake, I still use that term. However, Jasper reports at the end that the conversion of 5 to 6 families in Zaandam, which is very close to Amsterdam, and some families in Amsterdam and Rotterdam. You see the word dam all the time. Dam means that a dam is the same as the word dike. And what's before that is basically the river or the canal. In this case, it's the river. So there's the river Zaan, there's the river Amstel connected to Amsterdam, and there's the river Rotte, which is called to Rotterdam. So you know a little bit why the word dam is always on many towns and names. These conversions of these 5 families or in several families, however, is never recorded. We cannot find these numbers and names of these people. Then it is quiet for more than 50 years. 1869, Jasper leaves with some conversions, but no follow-up. And it takes the time until 1920 that Frederick M. Smith, you almost tend to think that because they did not succeed, those missionaries, he more or less says, okay, then I will do it myself. And he came to Europe for a long trip in Europe to several countries, Germany, France, United Kingdom, and also the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, they meet in Rotterdam, John Graven. John Graven was a convert from the Mormon Church. He was converted from the Mormon Church when he lived in Ogden, Utah. And Graven then returned back to the Netherlands. The reason for returning is not fully clear. It was not as a missionary, but probably maybe homesick or whatever reason. But he was back in the Netherlands, and he was met by Smith. And on January 21, 1921, 2 sons of Graven were so-called the first baptisms in the Netherlands in a bathhouse in Rotterdam. And as mentioned already earlier, first is not correct, it's inaccurate, as Jasper already baptized some people in 1869, but those records are not there. We cannot see them as official. So the official first baptisms were in 1921. And at that point, the church has learned that if you send missionaries, they should be native Dutch persons, by preference young couples, because they are flexible, they're easy to travel, they are home, they can easily move from one place to another. That was one condition. They mastered the Dutch language, so they can easily get in contact with people, and they get acquainted with Dutch customs. Dutch customs, each country has its own customs. And in order to reach people, you have to find how they act, how they think, and how they are being triggered. So 2 people are being appointed as missionaries, which is one, Wietse Bosma. His English name was William. You should there's a question, there's a mark behind his name, because in this story there are 3 vice-postma's in order to make it complicated. And there is Frank, but his Dutch name was Fokker, which is a little bit a strange word in English, but nevertheless, that's the way the guy is called in Dutch. They were both converted Mormons and lived in the USA, and from there on, they've been sent to the Netherlands. They landed in Liverpool first by the steamer Rotterdam, which you see here on the picture, and from there on, they traveled probably by train and ferry to Rotterdam, where they arrived in the same year, 1923. They arrived probably on the 4th or the 5th, and on the 7th of January, there was the first meeting of members of the Community of Christ in the Netherlands. That was in this house. It was at the house of John Graven. It is in Schiedam, which is a part of Rotterdam, and it was in the Lange Achterweg number 9A. It's still there, as you can see, because this picture has been taken last year. But it doesn't look so nice anymore, but it's still there. And there were 5 people attending, which was probably Graven and his family. But they sent out a lot of new invitations to all people they knew or they got acquainted with or who showed interest. And one of them was a choir leader, a choir director, Arie Peil. And we will mention that name because that has been a very crucial name in the development of the Community of Christ, especially in Rotterdam, but basically in the whole of the Netherlands. And in order to give you a little bit a picture of how things went in those days, a month later, there were baptisms in 1923. And this is one of the quotes which is very appealing and it shows a lot. A sharp wind from the east has kept temperature for many days below freezing point. The layer of ice on the canals kept shining. But it did not bother a group of people. With their hands and feet, they pushed away the ice. People watched this with amazement because 6 people went into the ice-cold water. At this moment, a baptismal service took place, which was of great significance for many people in Rotterdam and in other places of the Netherlands. 6 people were baptized. Arie Peil, his daughter, P.Z. Peil, C. Peil, W. Westerick, and W. Graven. And with wet clothes, they went into the home of the Peil family, Gustostraat number 24, where on the same day the confirmation took place. The Gusto Street was a street named after the Gusto shipyard, which was on the same place. And most probably Peil worked over there because those houses connected to the shipyard. There were factory houses. It was also under one cooperative, which is called Eendracht or Unity. But this is all gone. We cannot show you a picture because it's now all industry and it's now what they call the Merwede Harbor. In the same year, another 3 baptismal services were held, another 17 members added to the Community of Christ. And this is how that part looks like where the first baptisms then in open water took place. As you can see, it's a harbor area, it's an industrial area, and all the small houses which were there in the 20s are all gone. So we cannot feel anything about that circumstance yet. It took another year in order for the church to get officially organized. That happened in 1924. On February 1924, 21 members meet at the home of Arie Peil in Schiedam. Also present were apostles J.T. Curtis and Paul M. Henson. And the group voted unanimously to organize the brands and basically organized the Community of Christ in the Netherlands. That was the starting point of this church in the Netherlands. And Graven and Peil were ordained as elder Graven being elected as president, Nelly Peil as secretary, and Arie Peil as choir leader. And you see here on the picture, which is Arie Peil. And for those of you who have very, very sharp eyes, you can see that his paper, which he has in his hand, which he's supposed to read, is upside down. The photograph, the story is that the photograph asked him to take a paper in order to be more distinguished. And in that sense, he took this paper and read it, but it's upside down. The church moved on and was looking for a first church building. These, of course, as you can see, are modern pictures of those places. But in all places, you see there's a kind of garage, either in the old paint factory, which is now an apartment building, or in the car repair, which is the middle photo, or on the right side where you have the car wash. In all of three is a garage. And we could not recollect from all the data we have which number in this street was the number where the garage was for the first meetings. It was one of those three. It's not that decisive, but it's interesting to know, but we couldn't find it. The branch keeps going. And after having been back to the United States for some years for study, Feynstra, who took his wife this time with him, returned back to the Netherlands. In the meantime, so he came back in 1925. Arie Peil, in the meantime, was the president of the Rotterdam branch, as the first president, Graven, was no longer active. He there's no real reason found why, but Peil took over. And singing becoming more and more important. And Peil, as a choir director, found that we needed to have our own small, or we had our own hymnal. So he put together 50 songs and he called them Zion's Love Song. A very small, old, black booklet. It looked like this, old. In 1927, there were around 100 members. And there were three reasons for this growth. First of all, there were cottage meetings, which was new. People had visits, but not in this type of settings. There were strong spiritual meetings, where it almost sounded as it was called healings, which was not really the case, but nevertheless. And there were the open air services with a lot of singing. And there, of course, Peil was really the inspirator, because if you have singing on the street, on a corner, in a park, nowadays we call them flash mobs, but it attracts people. People are interested, people are curious. What is happening? Who is singing here? What is the music? What is the aim? Where is it for? And it will attract people. So in that sense, singing has been very important for the community of Christ. And that is also with some pride, as Joey was already saying, that last month we could present our first official hymnal in the Netherlands. And this hymnal is for sale in all the bookshops in Holland. It's on the internet, and it's been bought by also people outside the community of Christ, because many people see that these new songs with these new texts address issues which we have now in our days. Issues like inclusivity, issues like peace and justice. So that really helps out. So singing, music was very important for the start and the build-up and the development of the Rotterdam branch. We're going to move, because we were in Rotterdam. And let me also explain a little bit more, because you see here on the left side, next to the what they call North Sea, you have North Holland and South Holland. Those are the two provinces we call Holland. So Holland is only the western part of the Netherlands. So if you talk about Holland, you only talk about a small part. So please, if you talk about our country, talk about the Netherlands. We move up to the north. We're moving up to Zwaagwestein. We're moving up to the birthplace of Feynstra. Feynstra and Eggen just returned from the USA. And Feynstra goes back to his birthplace. And he does the same as the LDS missionaries in 1861 did. They go back to the they go back to their birthplace. There they have contacts. There they know the people. And there they can build a community. And Feynstra, together with his wife, they held open air meetings. And in one of those open air meetings, they met two ladies. One was Inske Postma, and the other lady was Hinke Westra. They met those two ladies, and those two ladies were baptized 3 years later together. So it was Inske Postma, together with the 7 months pregnant at that time, Hinke Westra, in a small river called the Swadde. You can see here the small river. You can see at the size of the boats that it's rather small. And this Inske Postma was married as a sidestep to Wietse Postma. And there you have your second Wietse Postma. The third one will still come. The first meetings were held in Inske Postma. You see the picture on the left side. And it's not a qualitative picture because in those days, people did not have mobile phones or digital cameras. So the amount of pictures available is very scarce. So we find ourselves lucky that at least we have a picture of this first baptism in this region. And we have a picture of their home, which is also quite unique because people did not make pictures of their homes. But this house, this home, is more or less the first home where the meetings of the community of Christ in the Zwaagwesteinde started. That was the start of a new episode in the history of the community of Christ in the Netherlands. It was significant. And there are milestones in that history. Because next to the foothold in the west, there is now also a foothold in the north. So there are two strong footholds, one in the west, where later on several other congregations were built out, and one in the north, where also several congregations were developed from. The mission is now spreading over the country, and it didn't stay in one place or only went out from that place. It's not only in big towns, in this case Rotterdam, but it's also on the countryside because Zwaagwesteinde is a small town. And now in that period, probably around 2,000 people, nowadays 5,000, so small. The new members were non-Mormon converts. We started with non-Mormon converts, but now we have people who originally were from Dutch Reformed or from Orthodox Reformed or from Baptist background or not even having a church background. And of course, missionary support was needed even more as John Eggen would return to the USA. So we have two guys for the missionary work and for the leadership built in the Netherlands, which was Arie Peil on the left side and Fokke Feynstra on the right side. Peil for the Rotterdam area, Feynstra for the Zwaagwesteinde for the north area. Zwaagwesteinde was growing. And they grew especially through open air services. There was much singing. And especially Feenstra's wife had a magnificent voice. And she was loved and they could hear their voice everywhere. During those meetings, there were some 300 to 400 people present. So there was a lot of singing, but it was also the message from Feynstra. And it was a simple message because we have to look to the countryside. We have simple people from simple origin. A lot of people were illiterate. A lot of people were handcraftsmen. So they didn't have a broad school education. But Feynstra was also a local. He was one of them. He could even speak to them in the local language, in the Frisian language. And his preaching was basically focused on the injustice of, let's say, the other churches. Churches who had a lot of rules and regulations and dogmas. Churches who were quite excluding people. Whereas he was preaching more, let's say, in a continuing revelation, that was important, but mainly he had words of invitation. Be part of the restoration, acceptance of all people, and he proclaimed inclusivity. There was an eyewitness, a lady who I admired and which I talked to her several times, and she described it as follows. It was austere and it was poor, but it was a group to which everyone was connected to, and there were many baptized. We're going to the Roaring 30s. And whereas Feynstra is concentrating his efforts in Zwaagwesteinde in the north, his boy town, Peil is concentrating his efforts in Rotterdam. And in 1931, membership has grown to 137, despite the economic crisis and the high employment rates. I do not have to explain the bad situations in the 30s. Most of the baptisms at that point were in Zwaagwesteinde, 2/3 of the total. And Rotterdam, as earlier, was still struggling to find a suitable building. They looked on the left side, the Oleanderstraat, and on the right side, you see the Gaasbeekstraat. And we took some historical pictures in order to have a little bit more atmosphere of how the town of Rotterdam at that point looked at. Because if you look to that streets now, for instance, in the Oleander Street, which is on the left side, that is all modern apartment buildings, and it doesn't have any atmosphere of it has in the 30s. So in those places, those streets, the church was looking for a place to come together. Zwaagwesteinde in 1932 had around 52 members. That meant that probably in Rotterdam they had close to 100. And meetings were held in the homes of people, as I showed you earlier, but later on also with families who had barns and stables where they could come together, or if that was still too small, in open air areas. In 1933, Wietse Postma, there you have number 3, Wietse Postma, became the leader of the group. And later, Marius van Oorschot, who was a deacon from Rotterdam, joined the group as well. Marius also moved later on to Zwaagwesteinde and found his to-be wife there. And a first church building, which was rented, where they could come together, is found in 1936. It was a furniture factory where they made all kinds of chairs and tables. The church came together in the left part of the building and then in the back side, which was rented, and they could come together in order to have some of the meetings. This is a very recent picture. There are no old pictures of that building. That led eventually in 1937 to the second congregation in the Netherlands. Next to Rotterdam, there was Zwaagwesteinde. And many members of Rotterdam were present in order to have that meeting organized. They all came in a bus in order to be present with this historical meeting. Present were Rushton of the European Mission, and he conducted the meeting together with elders Feynstra and Mosterdijk. Mosterdijk was at that point the president of the Rotterdam congregation. And the following people were elected. Wietse Postma as president, Marius van Oorschot as secretary, and Jan Soutsma as the financial officer. And then, at the end of the 30s, we have the Second World War. And that was a real break on the development and the growth of the church. In 5 years, in the Second World War, there were only 13 baptisms, very small. And there is not so much known about this period. There's not so much written down. A lot of activities came to a standstill due to the oppression and the occupation by the Germans. For instance, the church building in which Zwaagwesteinde was coming together was confiscated by the Germans in order to accommodate soldiers. And during the war, members from around the world of the community of Christ sent support. People sent clothes and soap and all kinds of other things to the Netherlands. On Graceland, there was even a project organized by Roosevelt, where a group of students could adapt or would adapt a Dutch family in order to support them. And that was a very successful program. Luckily, the war ended after 5 years. But the post-war period was also not easy. Especially the center of Rotterdam was completely destroyed by the German bombings in 1940. Young men were sent away to labor camps, and members were trying to rebuild the congregation in Rotterdam. And on the countryside, the damage was less bombings, less oppression, but also a lot of young men were sent away, and some did not return. In 1945, there were some 21 baptisms in Zwaagwesteinde, so there was some missionary again going on, and it was in a kind of a swing. And Marius van Oorschot, who lived in Zwaagwesteinde, even went to England to share his testimony, as you can see on this picture. We do not know which congregation this was, but as it has, you can see on the picture, it has happened. Every history has its dark pages. And Feynstra, the end of an era, I call this chapter. He was, let's say, the inspirator, the missionary who, together with Peil, built the community of Christ in the Netherlands. And with one of his visits, he met in a town called Groningen an affluent woman who was very sick. And he took her in her house, in his own house, in order to take care of her. That was not a very wise and sensible move. Within short, there was the accusation of having two wives. And polygamy was, of course, a hot item. And in order to show that at least the community of Christ has no connection with that polygamy, they were taking his membership away in 1946. Feynstra moved from his hometown. He moved to a place further away in the Netherlands, and he died in 1961. But for many, he is still the hero, as he brought the restoration at least to that part of the Netherlands in the north, and he was very supportive to all the activities in the west. His grave is still in Zwaagwesteinde and is still also maintained and paid for by the church. It sounds a kind of an apology. However, Feinstra's leave brought the congregation in confusion, but luckily it did not lead to any split. And in 1948, they moved to their own building in the neighboring town of Zwagerbos. Here you see it's now a house where a family is living, but in those days, the church hall was on the ground floor. On the left side, there was the entrance, and where this big window is, that was the main hall. And the families of Wietse Posma with 4 children and Marius van Oorschot with 3 children lived on the top floor, on the apartments above. And they stayed there until, this was the church building until 1966. And that brings me a little bit to the end of this presentation. And there are some final thoughts. Many details could not be mentioned as they were never written down and stayed, unfortunately, in people's mind. And this lecture, this study, this book is the first attempt to give an historical overview of the community of Christ in the Netherlands. But still, it reflects the bold evangelism of Feynstra, the musical lead by Ari Peil, the commitment of people like Kees Olijnsma as he stepped into the swatter water, and the courage of many others to join this unknown church. For many people, even called a sect. And in many places, there was a lot of hostility. There is a Dutch saying which says, unfamiliar makes unloving. And that is what's happening to several people. Several services were, how do you call it, stopped and abolished. People were called names as they were member of this church. And I think our gratitude and our appreciation is with them. What they sacrificed some 100 years ago, or over a period of 100 years, in order to bring us to the moment we are now. Because we now can look forward to 2024, 100-year anniversary of the Community of Christ in the Netherlands. Thank you for your presentation, and for your attention.
Well, thank you so much once again, Kees, for all of your research and all of your sharing with us this afternoon and evening in the Westerijn. It's time to bring our program to a close. So I want to also thank you, Peter and Barb, for helping us out behind the scenes. And lastly, we share our thanks to you, all of those out there in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ historic sites. I encourage you all to tune in next week as we welcome Keith Wilson to the Spring Lecture Series. Keith's lecture is called Clifford A. Cole, Architect and Refounder of the Modern Community of Christ. So Apostle Cole had an outsized role in transforming the organization, the Church of Joseph Smith III, into a modern community of Christ. And Clifford Cole did not crave the limelight, but nevertheless, more than any other individual, he quietly led the RLDS leadership away from the Joseph Smith restoration to the more modern Community of Christ of today. This presentation will seek to highlight the way in which Cole became the dominant leader during two crucial decades of redirection in the RLDS faith, from 1950 to 1970. Keith's lecture will begin at 7 p.m., so be sure to register and mark your calendars for next Thursday at 7 p.m. Central Time. And Barb has already dropped the link to the Spring Series page in the chat, so be sure to follow that link to register for next week's program. So until next week, take care, everyone, and have a good night.